Good morning to all of you. I'm a Uniapak person. Uniapak dates from 1931. For me, this is almost quadragesimo anno. Yeah? I said I'm a Uniapak man. This dates from 1931, which is for me, in my tradition, almost 40 years, quadragesimo anno, after Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum was the social doctrine which was written out to cope with the results of the Industrial Revolution. So that is what I all learned when I was a teenager in the 50s of last century. Not only these two encyclics and the social doctrine, but also I learned about another Jesuit, Teilhard de Chardin. He made it clear in his analysis that we human beings, the creation, if you like, can be understood only in relation with nature. So he made my life earlier as a religious person to understand better the relationship between the story of the creation and the history of mankind. So those were the 50s. In the 60s, my wife and me married rather young. She gave birth to 3 children. And at the end of the 60s, in our city, that's the port city of Rotterdam, I had to notice something peculiar. How was it possible that this city was so successful, ports and industry and so on, while at the same time the quality of life was going down? As a kid, I had still the flocks nearby in the streets. But then, at the end of the 60s, we are living there with smog, with water in which you could not swim anymore. So there was irritation about the economic success of that port city, and at the same time going down of the quality. Those days, I was a businessman. I was a member of Uniapak. And I thought at the end of the 60s, I have to do something in the public arena as well. Not politics, but an effort to work together with others to improve the quality of life, very simple in Rotterdam. And we did that already those days. It was called the so-called Rotterdam model. What was that? That we didn't say to the national government, you have to improve the quality of life, but that we thought ourselves, we have to take the lead as business people to see what new methods are possible to improve the quality of life. So that's the picture of the 60s. Also for me, a personal dimension because of my children. So there it started. Soon after, I was no businessman anymore because I was asked to become a young minister of economic affairs, trade. And there I had the privilege to meet a lady of my age, the then Minister for the Environment in Norway, which I met because we had a sort of disaster in the North Sea. Gro Harlem Brundtland is her name. And we became friends for life. Later on, Gro became the Prime Minister in Norway, and I became Prime Minister in the Netherlands. In the 80s, in my second government, I thought time has come to do something on the dimensions of the environment in the whole of the Netherlands. tried to write down a white paper bringing all dimensions together. This was a bit special those days. But I took the lead in Europe. At the very same time, Gro informed me that she was working on a document which got the name Our Common Future. In that document, she said to me, Ruud, we have to overcome the negative attitude against new technologies, but at the same time we have to find a way forward in which environment and development are pursued in parallel. Later on you got this conference, now we are talking Rio 5 years later, United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. But already 5 years earlier, Gro Harlem Brundtland with her colleagues, UN Board, defined sustainability as taking responsibility for the generations to come. You remember those days, your children and grandchildren. So there was a new dimension. Madam Brundtland and myself both went as prime ministers to Rio de Janeiro, 1992. This was the time of the euphoria of the market economy. All we were glad that we succeeded to convince the world that not a totalitarian system, not communism, was the way forward, but that we needed market economy all over the place. This was good. At the same time, we noticed that NGOs, civil society organizations came forward loudly and say, but ecology is as important as economy. And therefore, in Rio de Janeiro, the chair of that meeting, Maurice Strong of the UN, Under Secretary General, was urged to try to define a Earth Charter. It's of course proved not to be a thing which you could do in a few days. After Rio de Janeiro, me, still in the role of the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, decided to support this initiative. And something strange happened, because I was approached by people, citizens of the Netherlands, who said, these days we are fans of Gorbachev, the former leader of the Soviet Union. I was a bit surprised. I said, how can you be a fan of Gorbachev? And they said, after the demise of the Soviet Union, Michael Gorbachev decided to become president of a civil society initiative within the then still Soviet Union, which was called the Green Cross. You understand the word Green Cross is related, of course, to which we knew so well, Red Cross. And Green Cross was meant to be active in relation to environmental disasters. So Gorbachev became president of that institution when he was out of power. But Gorbachev said immediately, but listen, this is nice, but we need a more fundamental approach. Probably we even need a Earth Charter. So when I heard this, I invited Michael Gorbachev to The Hague, urged him to sit down with Maurice Strong, and the two of them decided and became the co-chairs of that Earth Charter initiative. Next step, of course, was to find somebody who had time and money to travel the world, to talk with all religions, different civilizations, because it was a civil society institution, to see how we could go forward together up to an Earth Charter. That process took quite some time. Let's say 7 years about. And then we said, now we know everything. Who was the key person in that process? This was a man named Stephen Rockefeller. Rockefeller? Yeah, Stephen Rockefeller, from a famous capitalist family, who has said to his father, we have accumulated enough money and we have organized charities to spend it. I think my role now is to go for a more ethical approach in life. So he said bluntly even to his father, don't make the next step going into politics and to political power. The Rockefellers better say enough is enough in terms of money. We see what we can contribute now to this Earth Charter initiative. So there was a long dialogue going around, 7 years, and then we concluded on a document. This is the Earth Charter. You can Google it and read it. So for a bit of the story of the Earth Charter. Now it's clear of what I said at the beginning, the things I said about the social doctrine. You remember, rerum novarum, quadragesimo anno, but then it was interrupted by the recession of the 30s of last century. Then we got the Second World War. We are living with all in a different situation. And after the Second World War, there was this effort, of course, to start decolonization. We are still living in a colonial world. So there we tried, people tried, in a fundamental way, to change, let's say, the situation for the good. And here is key, 1948, Universal Declarations of Human Rights. This was the ethical dimension in the thesis. All nations, all peoples have the right for their own democracy, sovereign democracy. But all those sovereign democracy have to accept that there are universal human rights. So this is 1948. And then we had, of course, the time to overcome the Cold War, because the reality of all days were the power struggle between the United States of America with his allies and communism. Then still mainly Moscow, later Beijing as well. And internationally speaking, all this going for values, at the same time we thought it was a power struggle. So this came to a new situation at the end of the 80s. Berlin Wall came down, but even before that, Chairman Deng had already decided for his people to go for a new China. Open your curtains, make use of all technologies, accept the market principles. In fact, they became part of the market system, China. So we're really living in a new life, and I said to you, a new situation. I said to you already, the enthusiasm about a market economy and the capacity to do that. So these were those years. I said a few words about the Earth Charter in this sequence in which I tried to explain to you that we people do not live with continuous the same values. We have to respond to the change of humanity, which there is anyhow, even without us, but we have a responsibility to give it shape and substance in a way that it is more acceptable, at least. And there I mentioned this already something of a change in the modern world. Now, a couple of years ago, with a few friends, I said, let's sit down and compare what were the values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, and what is what we are aiming about now in this millennium. 2000, Earth Charter, and other initiatives, like the Millennium Development Goals, and so on. So when we compare this Earth Charter, we are absolutely aware that we had to go on with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but maybe to add elements which are key. And I mentioned them to you. The first is about the basic idea of 1948. This was declarations of independence for all peoples and nations, the right of your own democracy. In 2000, we said, maybe more important is not the independence, but the interdependence, for good reasons. Interdependence. The second, mentioned that already, is we have to go from here for sustainable development. Take responsibility that generations to come, your children and grandchildren, have still a human world to live in. Second point. Third point. We are so proud to have independent nations, but all those independent, sovereign people have to be aware that anyway we live in a world with diversity of peoples, diversity of civilizations, diversity of cultures. It's very clear in some countries like here. It's not new, but it becomes key. We said it might be difficult to do so. So we made that an ethical value. Learn to live with diversity worldwide, but also within countries and even within companies. So this is the third. The fourth is that we said the model to change things for the good, which is governance. How to change things for the good was understood for a long time as a public responsibility of the democracy itself, of politics. But we Earth Charter people concluded, no, not any longer. Governance is only effective if it is complementary, which means that political power have to complement the power of companies. Companies themselves have a responsibility to give shape and substance to the future. And they cannot do that alone. Of course, they have to work with the politicians. But at the same time, they have to listen to and work with civil society institutions, with the citizens themselves. So it doesn't start with a mechanism to organize the whole world in a sort of UN model. Nonsense, we said. It has to be done by complementary governance. So this was the fourth difference with the time of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then finally, going around and listening to the people, we concluded that mankind these days feels that it is needed in our own life, but also institutional in organizations, to give a place to religion and spirituality. Now we have seen that change. I'm a European, very much on the European continent, where for a long time one was said all these ethical things and religions and convictions are not relevant for the public cause. Now it's changing. So this is the last point. 5 differences, if you see it. And it's not happening everywhere in the same way. There are differences, of course, in the speed. But one thing is very clear. In this conference, I hear about corporate social responsibility. That expression did not exist when I started as a professor on globalization. But now it is. So it has we are making progress. For me, it's gratifying, and I compliment the world of business to go for corporate social responsibility. In fact, this is a reflection of the new way of realizing changes for the good in the world. And that's the theme on this meeting. I would love to talk much more about all this, but I think it's better to discipline myself because there are many other speakers to come today. I just want to end to wish you a good, strong way of giving, as I said, shape and substance yourself. Yourself and your organizations, which are represented here in this meeting. Also the dimension of the values and the spirituality which you need to be strong in your values. And therefore I want to conclude this intervention with this point. Finally, I want to say this Earth Charter document, you better Google it and read it, ends, therefore, with the interesting words that we go for this and prosperity and peace and tolerance and what have you. And then we say, and the joyful celebration of life. So I wish you the joyful celebration of life. In this world is so much cynicism that we thought it is good to remind you that maybe this is a key value in itself. Go for the joyful celebration of life. Thank you.